We have some excellent starter models in the back. He said it the way men say things they've rehearsed too many times, quietly, pleasantly, with a smile that had never once considered being wrong. Something more in your range. The man holding the guitar said nothing. He stood at the vintage wall of Meridian Strings on Sunset Boulevard, Los Angeles, fingers resting on the neck of a 1954 Fender Stratocaster worth $640,000. Plain denim jacket, no watch, no announcement. He had walked in the way men walk into the one place they have never needed permission to enter. And shop manager Derek Walsh had assessed him in 10 seconds and made a decision that would take him 2 decades to recover from. The man lowered his hand from the guitar. He did not argue. He simply turned, with the quiet dignity of someone who has spent a lifetime choosing which rooms deserve his energy. In 35 years of handling vintage instruments, Derek Walsh had never once misjudged a customer. He was wrong now, in a way that had no ceiling. Because what Derek could not see, what no one near the front of that shop could see, was the man in the back corner beside a Marshall amplifier stack who had set his catalog down, risen slowly from his chair, and heard every single word. Stay with this, because what Carlos Santana does in the next 4 minutes has never appeared in any interview, any biography, or any documentary, but one man in that shop carried it with him for the rest of his life. Derek Walsh would later say that when he finally turned around and saw who was standing in the aisle behind him, his first thought was not embarrassment. His first thought was a single question. How long has he been sitting there? That morning had not started in a guitar shop. It had started with a phone call. To understand what happened inside Meridian Strings on October 11th, 1974, you have to understand where George Harrison was standing, not in the shop, but in his life. The Beatles had been finished for 4 years. 4 years of the world watching 4 men try to become themselves without each other, and struggling publicly with every attempt. George had done better than most expected. All Things Must Pass had silenced a generation of critics who had written him off as the quiet one, the understudy who had gotten lucky. But silence from critics and peace inside a man are not the same thing. And George Harrison, in the autumn of 1974, was carrying weight that no album could unload. His first solo North American tour was 3 weeks away. The rehearsals were difficult. And John Lennon, the one person whose opinion still landed differently than everyone else's, had pulled so far back into himself that reaching him felt less like a phone call and more like dropping something into deep water and listening for the sound of it hitting bottom. That morning, George had called him anyway. They had not spoken in 8 months. The phone rang 4 times. John picked up. They spoke for 11 minutes, about nothing specific, about everything underneath the nothing. When George hung up, he could not sit still inside 4 walls. He walked out of his hotel on Wilshire Boulevard and followed Sunset Boulevard west without a destination, the way men follow streets when what they are really following is the need to be somewhere that does not require them to explain themselves. He walked until a window full of guitars stopped him, and he went inside. In the back of that same shop, Carlos Santana had been sitting for 40 minutes. He was 27 years old, between recording sessions, restless in the particular way of musicians who have learned that creativity cannot be scheduled. He had grown up in Tijuana. His father played mariachi. At 10 years old, he arrived in San Francisco speaking no English, carrying a violin case and the specific courage of someone who has never been given a reason to doubt their own hunger. By 1974, he had played Woodstock, sold millions of records, and built a sound that belonged to no single genre and answered to no single tradition. He had also never forgotten being 17, locking into a guitar shop in San Francisco's Mission District, asking to hold a Stratocaster in the window, and being told by the owner that kids from Tijuana had no business touching a $300 guitar. He had been watching Derek Walsh since he walked in. He had been watching the man in the denim jacket touch the vintage wall. And when he heard those 6 words, "something more in your range," he did not move immediately. He sat completely still, because what came next was not an argument or a protest. What came next was silence. The man in the denim jacket simply lowered his hand from the guitar and turned to leave. And in that silence, Carlos Santana heard something he had spent 30 years learning to recognize. The sound of a man deciding the room was not worth fighting for. He stood up. Derek Walsh had not finished. That was the detail that mattered most about that morning. Not what he said the first time, but the fact that he kept going. He came around the counter with the easy authority of a man who had spent 15 years managing the distance between customers and inventory. And he began moving George toward the exit, the way experienced salespeople move people they have dismissed. Not with force, but with language designed to sound like service. He mentioned that the vintage pieces required a scheduled demonstration. He mentioned that the shop maintained relationships with premier collectors, and that walk-in availability for that tier was simply limited. He was not asking George to leave. He was engineering his departure while smiling, and doing it well enough that a lesser man might have thanked him for it. George had been in this room before. Not this shop, this architecture. His entire adult life had been a version of this conversation. The room deciding what he was worth before he opened his mouth. In Hamburg, John and Paul played the front. In the studio, his songs were rationed, 2 per album, while Lennon and McCartney filled the rest. At press conferences, journalists rotated to him last. He had absorbed all of it quietly and poured everything left over into his guitar, because music was the one place where no committee voted on whether you were enough. He moved toward the door, then he stopped. On his left, set inside a glass display case near the front window, sat a 1957 Gretsch Chet Atkins Country Gentleman. Sherry sunburst finish, original hardware, perfectly preserved, the price tag reading $780,000. George Harrison stood in front of that case and did not move for 6 seconds. Because at 13 years old, in a bedroom in Waverthorne, Liverpool, he had torn a photograph of this exact guitar from a magazine and taped it to his wall. He had stared at it every morning before school. He had promised himself that one day his hands would know what it felt like. He had played it for the first time at the Cavern Club in 1961, borrowed from a friend for a single set, and the feeling had never fully left his fingers. He did not ask to hold it. He did not ask anything. He simply stood there, a man looking through glass at the first thing he had ever wanted badly enough to build his entire life around. And Derek Walsh moved toward the front door to open it. If this story is doing something to you right now, stay with it. Because the next 60 seconds inside that shop change everything for everyone in the room, including the one man who thought he was in control of it. Derek's hand reached the door handle. His fingers closed around it. And then a voice came from the center of the shop. Unhurried, low, carrying the particular weight of someone who had decided exactly how much space he was going to take up, and had stopped apologizing for it a long time ago. It said 2 words. Leave it. Carlos Santana walked out from the back of the shop the way he played guitar, without announcing himself, without requiring the room to adjust, simply arriving at full presence and letting the air change around him. He did not rush. He did not perform. He moved down the center aisle with the deliberate calm of a man who had rehearsed this exact moment in 100 different rooms over 30 years, always arriving too late, and who had decided this time he was not going to let that happen. Derek Walsh heard the footsteps and turned. For 3 full seconds, he saw only a man in a colorful printed shirt, unhurried, hands at his sides, coming toward him from the back of his own shop. 3 seconds of nothing. Then recognition moved across Derek's face the way weather moves, slow at the horizon, then total, then impossible to outrun. His hand came off the door handle. Santana stopped in the center of the aisle. He looked at Derek for a long moment without speaking. When he finally spoke, his voice was level, not raised, not cold, simply precise in the way of someone who has chosen each word in advance and is no longer interested in choosing differently. He told Derek he had been sitting in this shop for 40 minutes. He said he had heard the phrase starter models. He said he was genuinely curious about the system Derek was operating on. What specifically, in this man's appearance, had indicated he needed to be redirected? The jacket? The sandals? The way his hands moved on the guitar? He would like to understand, because the assessment had been made in under 10 seconds, and he wanted to know what data that kind of certainty was built on. Derek opened his mouth. Santana raised one hand, not aggressively, only precisely, and Derek closed it. Santana turned to George. He extended his hand. He said his name, not because George Harrison did not know who Carlos Santana was, but because in a moment like this, introducing yourself is not information, it is respect. George took his hand and held it for a beat longer than a handshake requires. Two men who had spent their entire careers being told what they were not, standing in the same room at the same moment, both understanding exactly how the other had arrived there. Santana walked to the vintage wall. He lifted down the 1958 Gibson Flying V, $920,000, the single most expensive instrument in the shop, without asking Derek's permission, the way a man removes something from a wall when the wall has already forfeited its authority over him. He carried it to the center of the floor and held it out. George sat down on a stool beside the amplifier stack. He found the position his hands had lived inside for 30 years, and he played. Not a performance, something slower and more interior than that, the kind of playing that happens when a musician is thinking rather than communicating. When the guitar becomes less an instrument and more a place to put what will not fit inside language. The shop filled with it, searching, unresolved, genuinely private in a way that made everyone in the room feel they were hearing something they had not been meant to hear. Then Santana picked up his own acoustic, the battered one he had carried in from the session, not a shop instrument, and sat across from George and began playing underneath the melody, not competing with it, completing it. The two sounds moved around each other with the ease of men who have spoken the same language their entire lives and have only just been introduced. Derek Walsh stood at the door of his own shop for 4 minutes and did not move once. When George finally stopped, he set the Flying Five across his knees and looked at Derek. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Santana spoke. He said that the man sitting in front of Derek had written something, that he had written While My Guitar Gently Weeps, that he had written Here Comes the Sun in Eric Clapton's garden on a Tuesday afternoon because he needed somewhere quiet to put what he was feeling. He said that this man had spent his entire career being told to wait in the back room, by record labels, by the press, by the very band he built with his hands, and that Derek had walked into that history without knowing it and repeated every word of it in under 60 seconds. Derek's voice broke. He said, I didn't know. Santana looked at him for a long moment. Then he said quietly, That's the whole point, Richard. Derek's name was Derek. Neither man corrected it. And that single, very human, entirely unscripted mistake, the wrong name landing in the silence of a shop on Sunset Boulevard, made everything that had just happened undeniably real. Then George said something quiet, something that had nothing to do with guitars. And when he finished, Carlos Santana stood completely still for 11 seconds. Then he turned, walked to the glass display case by the front window, and laid his open wallet flat on the glass. What George had said was this. He told Santana about the phone call that morning. He told him about John, about 8 months of silence accumulating between two men who had built something together that neither of them fully understood until it was gone. He said that John had pulled back into himself in a way that scared the people around him, and that George had called that morning not knowing whether 11 minutes of conversation could reach someone who had gone that far down. He said he did not yet know if it had been enough. He said he had walked out of his hotel and followed the street west because he needed to be somewhere that did not ask anything of him. He needed wood and strings. He needed the one conversation that had never once required him to justify himself. He said, I wasn't here to buy anything. I just needed to remember what all of this was for. Santana turned to Derek. He did not ask. He simply looked at the display case. Derek's hands were moving for the keys before he had consciously decided to move them. The lock turned. Santana reached in and lifted out the 1957 Gretsch Chet Atkins Country Gentleman himself, carried it across the floor, and set it in George Harrison's hands. He said, "Play it. Not for the shop. Not for anyone in this room. Just to remember." George Harrison played the Gretsch for 3 minutes. No one spoke. Santana sat in the chair across from him with his eyes closed, the way musicians listen when they are not performing, when the sound belongs entirely to the person making it, and all you can do is be still enough to receive it. Derek Walsh stood behind his counter with his hands flat on the glass. This was not the confrontation. This was not the duet. This was something quieter and more permanent than either. One man playing the guitar he had taped to his bedroom wall at 13 years old, in a room that had tried to turn him away, while the man who had refused to let that happen sat across from him and listened like it was the only thing in the world worth doing. When George stopped, Santana stood. He walked to Derek and told him he would be purchasing the 1958 Flying V at full price. Derek began to offer a discount. Santana said no. He said the guitar had a full price because it was worth a full price, and that a discount offered in exchange for his silence about what had just happened in this shop was not a gesture he was interested in accepting. He paid, he took the case, he walked it across the floor and set it at George's feet. George said he couldn't take it. Santana said, "It isn't a gift, it's a debt. Every time I play for 10,000 people, I am standing on the shoulders of someone who played first. You played first. Take the guitar." George took it. If this story has stayed with you, you know what to do. Subscribe and leave one name in the comments. The most underestimated guitarist in the history of rock and roll. Because the answer might be closer to this story than you think. Derek Walsh watched them leave through the front window. The shop was completely silent. On the glass counter, Santana had left a business card face down. Derek turned it over. On the back, in handwriting that moved fast and left no space for revision, was a name, a phone number, and a single line. "When you're ready to work for something that matters." Derek picked it up, set it down, picked it up again. He did not call that week, or the month after. He called 4 months later, from a payphone on Sunset Boulevard outside the shop that was by then dark. The lease surrendered, the inventory cleared, the track lighting finally off. And the person who answered was not Carlos Santana. Derek Walsh spent the next 3 months in a quiet kind of dismantling. Not a collapse, something more deliberate than that. He liquidated Meridian strings the way a man closes a chapter he has finally understood. Methodically, without drama, item by item, until the walls were bare and the track lighting hummed over nothing. The business card sat on his kitchen counter for 4 months. The person who answered when he finally called was the director of a music foundation operating out of East Los Angeles, placing instruments in underfunded schools, running Saturday programs for kids whose neighborhoods had no music budget and no one advocating for one. Derek began as a volunteer. He cataloged donations. He repaired cracked guitar necks on weekends in a back room that smelled like wood glue and old strings. He taught a 14-year-old boy from Boyle Heights how to tune by ear, slowly, patiently, the way someone teaches when they are also learning something about themselves. That boy graduated from Berklee College of Music 12 years later. On graduation week, Derek handed him a card, not his own, but Santana's, and said only, "Pass it down when it's time." The 1958 Gibson Flying 5 was never photographed in George Harrison's collection. It never appeared in any estate inventory. People who knew George in his later years at Friar Park have said he kept one guitar in a room that was not a studio, just a room, with a chair and a window and no equipment. No one was invited in. No one knew what guitar it was. George Harrison died on November 29, 2001. 3 days later, Carlos Santana played a private tribute. No broadcast, no recording, just a circle of people who had known him. He played one piece that no one in the room recognized. A slow, searching melody. The kind of thing a man plays when he is thinking rather than performing. When he is remembering rather than celebrating. When the person he is playing for can no longer hear it. But he plays it anyway, because some debts do not care whether they can be received. George Harrison spent his entire career as the man in the denim jacket. The one who touched the guitar before anyone thought to notice. The one whose depth arrived without announcing itself, settled into the room quietly, and waited with extraordinary patience to be heard. Lennon had the lightning. McCartney had the architecture. George had something the other two needed more than they ever fully admitted. The understanding that music is not a performance. It is a conversation. Between the player and the instrument. Between the player and everyone they are carrying when they sit down to play. Carlos Santana understood that morning on Sunset Boulevard because he had lived every version of it himself. The boy from Tijuana who had been told precisely which rooms he belonged in and had ignored every single word. What he did inside that shop was not heroism. It was recognition. He saw a man being made invisible and refused to agree with the room. In 2023, in a gymnasium in Compton, California, a 12-year-old girl sits with a guitar that is slightly too large for her hands. A man adjusts her left fingers gently on the neck. She plays G minor. It rings through the gymnasium like something that has been waiting a long time to be released. On the wall behind her hangs a framed photograph of George Harrison. And beneath it, on a small card in handwriting that belongs to no one currently in the room, a single line. Play like no one is watching, especially when they aren't. If this story moved something in you, subscribe, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and tell me in the comments, who is the most underestimated musician rock and roll has ever produced? I read every single one, and the next story, I promise, goes even deeper than this one.